Hey, this is Jen Rubin, and this is Jen Rubin's Green Room. So what's going on this week? Well, the trial of Donald Trump in New York on charges of falsification of business records is drawing to a close. The defense has rested. The prosecution has rested. Next week, they're going to come back. They're going to make closing statements. The judge is going to instruct the jury, and they are going to decide his fate. It was not the trial that many anticipated. I think the evidence was stronger against Donald Trump. I think he didn't use the trial the way he wanted to, which was to appear defiant, to appear strong. He slept through a lot of it. He came out and he was whiny, he complained about the temperature. And of course, he set up this situation in which these pawns of his, these toadies, all dressed in red ties, blue suits, white shirts, toddled up to New York to pay homage to him. So I think in some ways he did damage to himself as well as to the Republican Party. But what really matters is what the jury is going to say. And I have to say, if he is convicted, and I think chances are that he will be, it will in large part be because of him. I think it was he who goaded his lawyers into asking way too many questions on cross-examination, so that whatever points they scored were lost in a just blur of nonsensical questions. I think it was he who encouraged Todd Blanche to scream, to screech really, at Michael Cohen, which did not make a good impression on the jury. And I think it was he who frankly forced his attorneys in their opening statement to say they were basing their theory of the case on the fact he never had an affair with Stormy Daniels. Now, of all the defenses, that seems to be the weakest, because of course he did. She was entirely believable, and there was no evidence to the contrary. So why make that claim? Why go in with that unprovable and unproven kind of claim? That's because his ego is at stake. He will not let other people think that he is weak. He will not let other people be right. He will not let other people show that he has been caught in a moment of weakness. And ultimately, of course, he did not testify. Am I surprised? On one level, no, because it would have been suicidal for him to testify. He is a liar. He is incoherent. He would be revealed to be even worse than he was described by other witnesses. But in a sense, I guess I am, because I always imagined that his ego, his desire to tell people off, was stronger than any concern he would have about conviction. But here's the thing, and I think it applies to the debates, which he said he wanted. The idea of telling people off, the idea of confronting people is very attractive to him because he thinks he's smarter and better and stronger than anyone else. He thinks he can bully people. But when it really comes to confronting people, that is to having other people ask questions of you, to have other people dispute what you are saying to your face, he crumbles. And that's because ultimately he's a coward and he's weak. He's a physical coward. We know he used every excuse in the book to get out of fighting in a war. We know that he is a moral coward who cannot confront other bullies, cannot confront evildoers, cannot tell his supporters the truth because he might lose their affection. So ultimately, I think what we get from this trial is a better sense of just how sleazy he is, but how cowardly he is. And we'll see if that continues on through the rest of the campaign. We'll see if he actually shows up to debate. I think not. Meanwhile, we have the unbelievable experience of a Supreme Court justice who flew a flag upside down over his house, a sign of identification with the mob, with those trying to overthrow the Constitution. At a time, he was considering cases disputing the 2020 election. That is Sam Alito. And we also got word that he sold a bunch of his Bud Light stock around the time that right-wingers were raising a hullabaloo about a trans person advertising their liquor. What does this tell us? It tells us he's a nut. It tells us just because he wears a robe and has a fancy degree, his mind is filled with junk. His mind is filled with conspiracy theories. He's as bad in some respects as Trump. Now, he says his wife was the one who flew the flag, fine, but he allowed it to stay up there. He knows what the rules of impartiality demand. He knows that even the appearance of partiality is completely unacceptable for a judge, and yet he does it. He does it because, like Trump, he's arrogant. He thinks the rules don't apply to him. He also did not disclose gifts as he should have been. He also accepted gifts from right-wing activists who have issues that they care about before the court. But this is what I think a lifetime tenure does for justices, unfortunately. It puts them out of touch, it makes them arrogant, and it actually promotes a disregard of judicial propriety, not encourage it. Now, given all of that, you would think the head of the Senate Judiciary Committee would be chomping at the bit to have a hearing, to question him, to actually demand his appearance, and to insist that finally a bill promoting ethics reform for the Supreme Court, a binding ethics structure, be put on the floor of the Senate. But no. We have Sam Alito's really attack, self-immolation of the code of ethics. And what do you have? You have Dick Durbin saying, I don't think it's really worthwhile to have hearings. Really only impeachment would be the solution, and we're not there yet. What? Do these people not know how to play? Do they not know how to make an issue? Do they not know how to alert the American people that one of our three branches of government has been utterly corrupted? What the heck is wrong with this guy? Well, he's been there too long, and he doesn't understand American politics. He doesn't understand the challenge that we face. He doesn't understand the necessity of calling Americans' attention to this outrageous dereliction of Alito's oath of office. Thank goodness, people like Senator Whitehouse and Senator Schumer are pushing back and are saying, no, I actually think we need to have hearings. And you know what? If he doesn't show up, they should begin impeachment hearings. Not because he's going to be removed, not because the House is going to actually take up impeachment, but because that's the only way to call Americans' attention to yet another atrocious attack on American institutions. You don't get this by simply allowing the press to run one story for one day during a long election season. You do it by focusing relentlessly on this MAGA mentality, which opines and promotes the idea that anything and everything is up for grabs so long as they can impose their white Christian nationalist view on the rest of us. And it is the threat that we face. It's the threat of our times. And if Democrats are not able to focus on it and to highlight it, the normalization of Trump that the media engages in is going to go on. And we will wind up with a Trump presidency, as much as I absolutely abhor the notion. Democrats have to be able to make the contrast. And you know who is making the contrast? It's President Biden. He's doing a pretty good job of it. And I'll give you an example. Over the last 24 hours or so, a video ran on Truth Social, which had a reference to the United Reich. This is the Third Reich. This is Hitler. This is fascism. Now, the Trump people say, we didn't make it, we just ran it. But they ran it, and they left it up there for overnight, almost 24 hours, frankly. And it's not the first time. This is the guy who quotes Adolf Hitler about blood purity. This is the guy who talks about a invasion of foreign forces. This is a guy who sits down to have a meal with a known Holocaust denier and anti-Semite. This is the guy who says Jews that don't vote for him are bad Jews and should have their heads examined. He is an anti-Semite, and he has delusions of dictatorial power. And the Biden administration actually jumped on that. Good for them. As we speak right now, the vice president has already spoken about this. The president is expected to speak about it. Their campaign called people's attention to it. And this is what you have to do. You have to make an issue of these things. Republicans are great. They can make an issue out of nothing, frankly. Look at their screwy impeachment hearings, which have found nothing on President Biden. But they know how to play the game. And I don't want to diminish politics by calling it a game, but you have to understand how you accomplish your aims. You don't accomplish your aims by allowing the New York Times to set your agenda. You don't accomplish what you set out to by simply rolling your eyes and saying, well, that's Trump for you. You have to bring the issue to the attention of the American people. So I give some kudos to Schumer and to White House. I certainly hope they have judicial hearings. And I give some credit to President Biden, who really has been trying to carry the message that this guy is a kook, that this guy, Donald Trump, is going to destroy our democracy. That, as he put it, something snapped in Donald Trump in 2000. And he won't accept that he lost. He won't accept any restraints on him. And so the only solution is to beat him and to make sure he doesn't get anywhere near the Oval Office. That's what Liz Cheney says. That's what the Democrats say. That's what Adam Kinzinger says. And that's what a lot of people who used to serve in his administration say. So what do you do about it? You are not powerless. You are not without options. You can make a difference. And what do? You volunteer to work on campaigns. You give some time or some money to organizations like Swing Left, which we're going to hear about later. You give money and time to organizations like the ACLU and the NAACP, which are fighting against voter suppression and voting discrimination. You volunteer to be a poll worker. You make sure you're registered to vote, all the people you know are registered to vote, and that they do vote. And you use whatever platform you have to try to correct the record and to remind people you know and who may follow the news less closely than you do about what's going on in the world. And that's how collectively we defend democracy and win the election. So remember, it's all in your hands. If you're a Democrat or an independent who tends to vote Democrat, or a Republican who's planning on voting Democrat to save our democracy, you're probably nervous. You should be. This election is not in the bag by any stretch of the imagination. Donald Trump could win. And if you're obsessed with polls, despite the fact I urge you not to be, you periodically get really freaked out. I'd suggest, once again, you ignore those polls and you look at the actual campaign each of these presidential candidates is running. And when you look at the Biden campaign, you also have to look at the circle of Democratic activists, volunteers who are helping to get the message out, who are not only helping President Biden, but targeting vulnerable Republicans who sit in districts that President Biden won in 2020. Those people may be the difference between winning and losing. And fortunate for us, we have the head of one of the most important of those, Swing Left, which is targeting those very congressmen. And we're going to learn a lot about what goes on behind the scenes to make a campaign successful. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to welcome Yasmin Radjy.
Thank you so much, Jen. It's great to see you.
Great to see you too. Tell us, what is Swing Left?
Swing Left is an organization that was founded in 2017 in response to the election of Donald Trump. It launched right on Inauguration Eve. And we exist to make sure that people across this country, whether they've got time, money, or a combination thereof, are channeling their resources to the most impactful elections to make sure that Democrats have the balance of power. And in 2018, as you well know, that was a cycle where the balance of power needed to shift by winning back the House. And so that was our first line of defense against Donald Trump and MAGA extremism. And ever since then, we have expanded our levels of the ballot to also include the US Senate and also, of course, the presidency. We had to make sure that we were electing Joe Biden and Kamala Harris in 2020, and we'll do so again this year. And then also making some inroads at the state level, both through governor's races and state legislative races.
For the House, which of those seats do you put at the core of your targeting campaign?
Yeah, so the exclusive lens for all of our targeting, including the House, is competitiveness. So where are the places where if someone has a small amount of money or a large amount of money, a small amount of time or a large amount of time, where they can actually help flip a district. So these are frontline races, meaning these are races where it's a competitive Democratic held seat, or what we call red to blue races, seats that are currently held by a Republican, but with a little bit of organizing and better resources towards the Democratic candidate, we could flip those from Republican held to Democratic held. And we see that competitiveness metric as our North Star. We think that we've got a big tent among Swing Left volunteers and donors, meaning a lot of our folks disagree on who their optimal Democrat might be at any level of government. But we really see that if we don't have Democratic control, both at the federal and at the state level, then our nuanced policy disagreements are null points because our government will be sort of co-opted by extremists that we disagree with about basically everything. And so that competitiveness is really all that we look at.
Now, are most of the targeted Republicans in your scope, in your core group, people who are sitting in districts that Joe Biden won
Yes.
in 2020? So give us an example of somebody who ran perhaps as a moderate in 2020, but has just towed the line for Donald Trump and MAGA, and frankly is wildly out of kilter with his or her district. Give us a couple of examples of that.
Yeah, I think a great example is Brian Fitzpatrick in Pennsylvania's 1st District. He is running against a woman named Ashley Ehaz. I hope I'm pronouncing her name correctly. And he is a candidate, Brian Fitzpatrick. He's been in Congress now for several cycles. And you all your listeners may have seen him on MSNBC or on CNN. He comes off as tremendously moderate. He comes off as someone who more centrist Democrats might support. And yet, like so many so-called, in air quotes, moderates in the Republican Party, vote with Donald Trump overwhelmingly and vote on the sort of furthest extreme ends of the party time after time after time, and are really good in kind of wrapping up that extremism in a really moderate outer cloak, but it's a very thin outer cloak. And his opponent, Ashley is first of all, very supportive of the core values of the Democratic Party of democracy and freedom. She's much more in tune with where her district is in sort of purple Pennsylvania, sort of suburbs of Philadelphia. And the amount of momentum that she's built has been really inspiring. So one of the reasons I'm thinking of this district first is in the first weekend of her general election, which was just last month, we had just under 100 Swing Left volunteers show up, both from within her district and also coming in from New York, from the suburbs of Philadelphia, to come knock on doors for her, really with a lot of enthusiasm, because we know districts like this, as you mentioned, we call them the Biden. I know a lot of your listeners are familiar with this term, but the Biden 18, the 18 districts that include Pennsylvania's 1st District, that Biden won, that are, people voted Democrat for the top of the ticket, but by small margins, Republican was elected to the House. And so the majority of our what we call red to blue districts are those Biden 18. And again, our House margin is so small. We don't need to win all of those districts. We need to hold our frontline seats and then just flip a few of those districts. And I mentioned Pennsylvania, which I think is probably not a surprise to your listeners. But actually, the majority of those Biden 18 districts are in New York and California, which surprises people who are not closely following those House races. And so I say that because I think a lot of folks, this has been core to swing left's model from the beginning. People who live either in blue states or in blue districts or in really red states and red districts often feel really far removed from purple turf. But most of us live within a 90-minute drive of a swing district. And that is particularly the case in places like New York and California this cycle.
One of the things you guys specialize in is, if you will, the blocking and tackling of politics. You actually get out there and you knock on doors and you talk to people. How important, in your view, especially in House races, is that kind of activity?
It's essential. I think it's core to our theory of change, not just sort of in each election, but for the long haul, for a few reasons. First of all, every single district and every single state that we are targeting is extremely close. We live, as you well know, and as we all know by now, everything is a sort of comes down to a margin of error level of closeness. It's what we're going to see. No matter how the Biden campaign goes, no matter how the Trump campaign goes, the presidential election is going to be extremely close. The same is true in the Senate. The same is true in the House. And so much is going to come down to what we call sweat equity. How much work are we putting in to make sure that the most competitive races have the dollars they need to persuade voters who are on the fence, to get out voters who may not be motivated, and all of that. I like the way you put it, blocking and tackling. Is all about the margins, and something that we track really closely. We've got our slate of targets for the moment, and if there's a race where they've got more than enough money or more than enough volunteers to be able to sort of get across that final finish line, then we move on to the next target. But for us, that is the most important thing. And there's a lot that's not in our control, like. Sometimes a race will come down to, did it snow that day? Was there a road closure? Things like that in these really, really close districts. And so what we can control is getting those early dollars in. And what we can control is making sure that, a candidate has as many boots on the ground talking to voters to make sure that voters are aware of what's at stake and mapping what's at stake to the candidate. And, one just final point on this to reinforce just how important it is. That's not just about kind of messaging being controlled at the national level. Is I'm sure you've seen the recent polling that an overwhelming number of Americans in swing districts believe that Biden is responsible for the overturning of Dobbs, right? Like, that is something the Biden campaign is going to get on TV about that. We have a lot of work to do to make sure that voters are understanding that the overturning of Dobbs is a Trump problem and that Biden is going to be an essential part of making sure that abortion rights are the law of the land and that there's federal protections for women's reproductive freedom. But so much is also just, someone talking to someone face to face, someone picking up the phone and calling someone and planting additional seeds that reinforce the messages that they're going to be hearing on TV, but maybe tuning out, or they're going to be seeing on digital ads, but may not trust. And so we see that as our role, is to have those both face-to-face conversations and more personal, non-face-to-face messages, including through things like handwritten letters that sometimes might break through to someone in a way that a TV ad might not quite get them across the finish line.
And you said something that I think is so important. We who do this all the time and people who listen to podcasts vastly overrate how much information voters who are not political have. They vastly overrate not only the amount, but the accuracy of what they have. And that's what campaigns are about. They're about educating people, about persuading people. Tell us some of the red to blue districts. In other words, Republicans who are sitting in districts where they really kind of not represented those people and represent pickup opportunities for the Democrats.
Yeah, so I think one district that that I'm particularly excited about is out in California in one of the suburbs of Los Angeles. Republican named Mike Garcia. This is an incredibly close turf. Again, just a very short drive from the city of Los Angeles. Mike Garcia is someone who supported a bill in Congress that would have not just outright banned abortion, but also would have banned many forms of birth control. So, like, this is the level of extremism that we're talking about
Right.
here. He's also someone, I'm sure many of your listeners are following all of the latest news coming out of Boeing. He's someone who had information about, because of his role in Congress, about the safety risks happening with Boeing before those were public, and then sold his stocks in Boeing before that information was public, so he could profit off of the information that he ought to be using in terms of serving his country. So just a really gross guy, not only extreme, but also just kind of just a nasty non-public servant. And he's running against an incredible candidate called George Whitesides, who's not just someone who stands for public service in everything that he does, but also is running a fantastic campaign, a campaign that is really centered around bringing people into those, again, face-to-face conversations, running a great volunteer operation, really getting out there. And he's the kind of candidate that we're looking at as the more that we can get out there, both face-to-face and, again, in that personal outreach, to make sure that folks who might see a Mike Garcia through a really well-curated, really well-message-tested ad on television are also hearing about how great George Whitesides is. And also, even if they don't remember that much about George Whitesides, which is fine, people don't do politics full time, that they understand that the Democratic candidate in that district is someone who's going to stand for what the vast majority of Americans stand for across any issue that they care about.
And let's flip on the other side. You also look at Democrats in districts that either Biden didn't win or just very close, that may be vulnerable, and you have to play defense for those people.
That's right.
Give us a sense of a few of those.
Yeah, so we've talked a little bit about California. There's a number of these all across the country. Two states that I want to highlight. One is Ohio. Ohio has been one of our biggest investments, both in 2023 and now here in 2024, for a few reasons. One is that there was a reproductive freedom ballot on the measure in Ohio. So Ohio has been tilting red, but is a state where we won abortion rights twice in 2023. And in 2024, Sherrod Brown is a tremendously important Democrat to reelect at the Senate level. It's going to be really, really competitive. And this is not a competitive presidential state. Now, I'm saying all that about Ohio before answering your question about the House, because there are two really, really competitive frontline races in Ohio that we are targeting because they are competitive. That's Congressman Greg Landsman outside of Cincinnati, in the Cincinnati area, and then Amelia Sykes over in the Akron area. Two fabulous candidates, very hardworking, really aligned with their districts. And we need them to win because they're going to be essential to a majority. We also need them to win because if we can't boost turnout in their districts, it's not going to be possible for Sherrod Brown to win, particularly because Ohio is not on the presidential map for Democrats, unfortunately, anymore. So they're not going to be getting those additional boosts. So we call that reverse coattails of we're investing in some of those down ballot House races with the hopes that will help Sherrod Brown and vice versa. So those are really, really important. And I think it's a state that's not really on folks' radars quite as much down ballot because of where Ohio's been trending. And then in New York, we've done a ton of work, again, in both the special election timelines and also general elections for Congressman Pat Ryan. That's a district that he just won in very, very recently. He's one of our newest elected Democrats in the House. And we need to make sure that he's still there. And so he's been someone that we've been sending a ton of volunteers for. And I say for all of these frontline districts or districts that are controlled by Democrats in competitive seats, I'm hoping that when you and I have this conversation again in September, I don't say those names again because we've helped them raise enough money and get enough volunteers secured that we can actually take them off our map. And so part of why we're investing in those places early, and I mentioned on purpose Ohio and this, Pat Ryan's New York district, because we started doing that early investment in 2023 with the hopes that that will give them the foundation that they need to not only scare off strong Republican opponents, but also to have the infrastructure they need to become, sort of non-competitive, so we can focus on those red to blue races.
We've talked about, in passing, abortion many times. And I'll share an anecdote with you. In the months right after Dobbs, when the mainstream press was talking about the red wave still, I talked to 5 or 6 women, Democrats, who are either in swing districts or had competitive races. And they all said, we're going to lean into the abortion issue. And almost all of them ran ads that specifically targeted that issue. Every single one of them won. Is that still a important, even vital issue for Democrats? And how is that working in individual races?
It's huge, and I say that not just with the sort of post-Dobbs lens on all of this, but also, as you know, I was the national political director at Planned Parenthood Action Fund before Dobbs through the 2020 cycle, and we were seeing a trend line of more and more support for reproductive freedom, and then with the Dobbs decision, this sort of things grew exponentially, as we well know. And I think a couple of things that are really important. Number one, even before Dobbs, bipartisan support for abortion access was really, really high. I think the numbers before Dobbs were in the 70s, 70%, 75% in terms of general support, not for sort of unrestricted abortion access, but for the right for people to have bodily autonomy and make whatever decision they want to make about their bodies when it comes to reproductive freedom. And that's only grown since Dobbs. And so I think, I joined Swing Left in the summer of 2022 after serving in the Biden-Harris administration. And the negativity, I think I met you very soon after I started the role, and we met for coffee to vent about the state of the world and also, try to infuse some hope about what was moving forward. And I think what you and I discussed then that remains true now is there was a real underestimation about how much backlash there would be, not just from Democrats, but also from independents and Republicans who are a part of that majority of Americans, that growing majority of Americans who think the Republican Party has gone way too far in terms of restricting freedom, particularly as a party that its messaging is supposed to be all about freedom and sort of government not being in people's business. And government is very much a part of women's business now in the most personal ways possible. So we all saw in 2022 just how much that issue animated voters, Republicans, centrists, and of course, Democrats. But then I think something that we have a shorter attention span on collectively as a country is how many wins we had in 2023 also. Every single time abortion was on the ballot, every single time, including in red states like Montana, in purple states that have trended redder and redder and redder, like Ohio, abortion rights have won every single time. We do not have a single loss since the Dobbs decision. And so as we go into 2024, I think, we don't have any concern that this will remain an animating issue. I think the couple of questions that we have that we are organizing around are how much of an animating issue will this be? And we don't think that that is a sort of a floating question that we don't have any agency to control. I think the more that we talk about just how extreme these specific candidates that we are running against, people like Mike Garcia, people like basically every single candidate who's running for the Senate, the House, and of course, Donald Trump needs no mentioning, but I will mention him specifically anyway. the more that we talk about that, the more that we can keep this as a front of mind issue for people. So that's tremendously important for us. And the other thing is, abortion will be on the ballot in a bunch more states this year, and states that will really matter. So front of mind for us is Arizona. As folks know, there was a Civil War era law on the books in Arizona that was a total abortion ban. That has since been removed from the books in Arizona. But abortion rights are still very, very shaky in the state. There's a 15-week ban on the books. There's a lot of questions about whether the rescinding of that antiquated law actually is going into effect yet. Anyway, all sorts of stuff just to say abortion rights are really on the fence in Arizona, and very out of step with where Arizona voters are. And in November this year, there will be an amendment on the ballot that people will actually be able to vote on whether or not they support, women's reproductive freedom in the state. And that matters on its face. It also really matters because we cannot win the US Senate without Rubin Gallego. It also really matters because one of the states where Biden, I'm sure many of your listeners are reading all the same anxiety-producing polls like the New York Times Siena poll earlier this week. So we can see all collectively that Biden is polling lower in Arizona than he is in a bunch of other swing states. So there's a lot of reasons why Arizona really matters. And there's key House races as well. And, the fact that abortion will be on the ballot, literally, and then also that all of the people from Joe Biden on down are also manifestations of abortion being on the ballot. All of that's going to be really, really important. And so anyway, to answer your question, yes, it will matter. It will matter more if we continue to talk about this as much as humanly possible. And we shouldn't take for granted that people will remember what we told them, today. In a few months, we need to keep talking about it, keep talking about it, keep talking about it, and drawing that connective tissue that if you are supporting abortion rights in a ballot measure, that means you also should be voting for Joe Biden. And if you're supporting abortion rights in a ballot measure, that also means you need to support Rubin Gallego and Democrats up and down ballot because of how partisan the issue has become from a candidate perspective, even though the issue is incredibly nonpartisan when it comes to voters' individual support for reproductive health care access.
And that will be on the ballot in many states, including, for example, Florida.
Yes.
So to carry out your metaphor of the reverse coattails, it may be that a certain congressional seat in Florida isn't particularly close, but you can boost that Democrats' chances considerably because there's going to be an abortion issue on the ballot that will drive turnout that can then be tied to that race. So you're really looking at kind of a matrix of states, even where the presidential election might not be competitive, even where you have congressional or a Senate race that you're not particularly optimistic about it. You put abortion on the issue, on the ballot, and suddenly you have something that Democrats can rally around, and independents and Republicans who don't like the government telling them what to do.
That's right. And Florida, I'm so glad that we brought up Florida. Also, just to put a finer point on the ballot measure that you were describing, Florida currently today has a 6-week ban on the books. A 6-week ban is before almost any woman knows that she's pregnant. In my 2 wanted pregnancies of my 2 beautiful children, I did not know I was pregnant until week number 7, right? So this is not a theoretical. Anyone who has sort of had a wanted or an unwanted pregnancy knows how early this is. It's extremely unpopular with voters, but most voters are also not thinking in weeks of pregnancy, and so don't realize, as just a talking point on a TV ad, just what a 6-week ban means. And one of the most sort of eye-opening stats I remember was when South Carolina passed a 6-week ban several years back. There was polling in the state asking, do you support a 6-week ban? And it was like in the low 80s% of South Carolina voters said no. And then the next question was, do you know that there was a 6-week ban passed in South Carolina? And it was about the same percentage. Vast majority of South Carolinians who did not know that their own state had a 6-week ban. And so I say that, this is returning to your earlier point of voters are busy. people have a lot going on in their lives professionally, and their families don't need to care about politics. That is not sort of why they get going every day. But when we tell people about what has already happened in their states, what Republicans in Congress are proposing today, we are not sort of having to paint a picture of the future. The present day, folks are on our side, but will they remember is up to us. Reminding them, will they draw that connective tissue is up to us, helping them to make those connections, given, again, how busy they are and how much they may be thinking about other things.
And to carry that through, we never thought a few years back we would be talking about IVF, we would be talking about birth control. These Republicans now have a voting record. They voted for the so-called life begins at conception, which means you can't have IVF, which means many forms of contraception are not allowed. So to the extent that voters don't know that, that's a growth opportunity for Democrats. That education process has an ability to really grow the vote. And I think very often when people see these polls, they freak out. But of course, what voters know and think today, if folks like Swing Left and the Biden campaign and Democratic campaigns know their business, will not be what they know in 6 months from now. So the landscape, from your perspective, will hopefully change dramatically.
That's exactly right.
When you look at candidates at the state level, which ones are you looking at, and are there particular races that you have your eye on?
Yeah, so we, similarly to the metrics that we use for our federal targeting, at the state level, we look at balance of power. So we don't have an issue threshold. We don't sort of go based on who is the most charismatic or most compelling state legislator, but where are the states where we have an opportunity to gain a trifecta, to block Republicans from a trifecta, or to flip one or two chambers. And so I say that because for us, the reason why we added state legislatures onto our targeting, and that was something that we added, our first cycle was in 2018, as I mentioned, our second cycle was in 2020, was because of a recognition that I think more and more organizations and volunteers and donors are aware of. And that's that we have been overly short-term in our thinking as a Democratic Party. So we bucket our state work into immediate short-term games. Where are the places where we have, like returning to Pennsylvania, this is a divided government in the state of Pennsylvania. Republicans have the Senate, Democrats have the House, and we have the governor. They have the Secretary of State, so it's very hard to get things done in Pennsylvania. And in fact, when I was serving in the administration recently and working on American Rescue Plan implementation, I specifically remember we were being blocked from getting funds into the hands of people in Pennsylvania, and our policy team had a call with members of the Pennsylvania legislature who were just sort of delaying and delaying and delaying, and my brilliant policy colleagues who don't think in cynical electoral terms didn't really understand what was going on. And it was not hard to read between the lines of their delays were waiting until after the November 2022 election, because they believed that they would then have a Republican trifecta, and then all of these, tens of millions of dollars that would be going into different communities across the state of Pennsylvania for COVID relief, for emergency rental assistance, for making sure that there's enough dollars to help small businesses get back on their feet. All of these things that the Republicans would be able to control where those dollars went. And I say that because when we talk about in a place like Pennsylvania, where I am hoping that we can make sure that we're growing, our House majority is very, very, very thin. I think it's, if I'm not mistaken, I think it's 3 seats. It's in that ballpark. I can't remember exactly. And then the Republicans have a very, very narrow Senate majority. If we can grow our House majority, maybe flip the Senate as well, and of course, make sure that we've still got a Democrat in the governor's mansion year after year. That's not just something that feels good and sort of grows the bench of candidates and yay, maybe one of them will run for president or for Senate or whatever the case may be. It's really important from a material standpoint of when there is progress, even that's happening at the federal level, like the American Rescue Plan. it is often that progress is stunted by our lack of power in the states. And that's, on the other side of that, there's so much that in the ways that people relate to government that has nothing to do with the federal government, that has to do with the funding for their schools comes from their states, the funding for their roads comes from their states. And so I know that your listeners know this all really well, but even folks like my parents, who I think they probably read the New York Times cover to cover, and they, subscribe to the New Yorker and to all sorts of, they read all the time. They live in California, and I remember talking to them where they described to me that the only way they kind of figured out who they were voting for state legislature was the day before their election, mostly looking at our next door neighbors' yard signs, because for them, state elections don't feel that pressing, whereas national politics animate so much of their imagination. So that's my long answer to say, we look at the balance of power. We don't expect that volunteers and donors around the country are going to know every single one of the thousands of state legislators that we need to elect all across the country. What we do want them to pay attention to is places like Pennsylvania, where we need to elect Joe Biden, that we're also making inroads at the state level. Places like New Hampshire, North Carolina, all these states are going to be, Michigan, really, really critical to either grow or maintain Democratic power.
There's a lot of talk in every election, but perhaps more so in the last few, about immigration. And Democrats in the past have been defensive, not because they want, quote, open borders, but because Republicans made it an issue and beat Democrats over the head and accused them of not wanting to have borders, secure borders. Of course, earlier this year, there was a bipartisan, extremely tough border measure. Didn't include DACA, didn't include a lot of things Democrats have wanted for years. And Donald Trump didn't want it passed because that would make Biden look good. So Republicans sunk it. That is a tremendous fact for Democrats. But if voters don't know about it, it's a non-event. How important is that issue in a state like Arizona or a state like California, which has a real concern about immigration, illegal immigration, to educating voters so that they know the candidate who is in favor of a tough border security measure was the Democrat, and the Republicans were the ones who sunk it?
Yeah, it's first of all, I think immigration, I will be shocked if immigration is not one of the top 3 issues this election cycle. I think there is no question. And as I talk to our candidates, as I talk to the organizations on the ground that we partner with in swing districts and swing states, that is reinforced in every conversation. But it is primarily, we talk about immigration as a worry issue, not as an opportunity issue, the way that abortion being the top issue for us was a worry issue a decade ago. It's an opportunity issue now, in that people are on our side. And I think immigration is trickier for, the reasons that you've touched on. And that is that it is a more animating issue for conservatives than it is for liberals. And that's sort of shown poll after poll after poll. People who are really upset about what they're seeing on Fox News in the sort of invasions that they are imagining happening all across the country, they're much more likely to turn out on this issue and their perception of who is stronger on the issue. So that's sort of part one of we're on defense rather than on offense here. And the second is exactly what you said, which is regardless of whether someone has a progressive or a centrist or a conservative stance on immigration, there has been no movement on immigration policy in this country for basically since George Bush, right? Like it has just been at a complete standstill in this country. And anyone who cares about progress, whether that's progress for securing the border, whether that's progress for DACA, whether that's progress for just any type of reasonable pathway to citizenship, the only people who have been moving that forward are Democrats. And Democrats who, let's not sugarcoat it, Democrats vehemently disagree within our caucus about what progress on immigration should be. And to me, that is healthy. That is great. It is awesome to me that there are different ideas from progressives and from centrists about the future of immigration in this country. And in a healthy democracy, those debates are happening, and we are making incremental progress that makes some people happy sometimes, makes other people happy the other times. And I think what we saw in the recent immigration fight was a few things. One is that Democrats were actually trying to put forward some solutions and get some things done, and Republicans were playing the cynical politics that they, not just Republicans, Donald Trump specifically, as we have now seen time and time again, playing cynical politics of talking about immigration all the time in the most hateful, horrendous ways, but then actually trying to block any progress on securing our borders, right? So it sort of just unveils how little this is actually about the substance of the issue and making progress in a way that that would animate even the most conservative voters in this country who want progress on this issue. But the other is, I think, that I saw that a lot of the conversation then became among Democrats of sort of where should we fit on the spectrum of this? And I think that's, again, a healthy conversation that we ought to have. It's a conversation that I can't wait for us to have when we have a trifecta of Democrats controlling the White House, controlling the Senate, and controlling the House. And we've got some cushion in that trifecta. And I don't say that as sort of like, let's wait on important policies that are impacting people in the present day. But let's not let our disagreements on issues which are meaningful, which are serious, and which are vast get in the way of the North Star of we cannot make any progress on the issue if we have someone in the White House who believes that millions of people should be deported overnight and who has sort of, la land ideas about building a border wall, which will actually do nothing to secure the border. And so I can't wait for that reality when we actually get to substantively get into what policies will be best for this country, but we're not yet in that moment.
So if listeners are sitting at home saying, this sounds great, what can I do? What can they do, Yasmin?
Folks can sign up today at swingleft.org. I think that the thing that I would ask folks to think about is the resource that they have time? Is it money? Is it a combination of the two? Are they not sure and they want to sort of dip their toe in? And to sort of put together a mental budget of the day after the election, or, realistically, 2 days after the election, the votes will still be counted because it'll be really close no matter what happens.
Right.
But in the moment when the votes are called, hopefully we are in a celebration of a trifecta and increased power in the states. Hopefully we are not revisiting our 2016 trauma of the worst things happening at various levels of government. But on that day, as we look back on this cycle, look back feeling like you gave everything that you could. And what that is defined as is different from each of us. I have a neighbor just 4 doors down who has a toddler. Both parents work crazy hours. And she said she has made a commitment to, 1 day a week, she and her husband are going to, once their toddler is down, write letters to voters through Swing Left's affiliate Vote Forward. And they're going to canvass twice towards closer to the election. That is her goal. Other of our supporters set a financial budget of every month they can afford to give this much to competitive candidates, and they are making that as a sort of auto payment going to competitive candidates. So it varies, but what is a meaningful difference, or what is a meaningful investment and budget that you can make? And Swing Left, we see ourselves as the one-stop shop so that whatever that meaningful time, money, or combination thereof is going exclusively to the most competitive races. And so that hopefully in the podcast conversation that you and I have together in December or January or wherever, we can really get into what can Democrats do with our power and all these great ideas that we've got, all these debates that we can't wait to have. We are actually able to move forward rather than sort of be on defense with the most extreme members of our government, being in control.
That is so helpful, because I cannot tell you the number of times I am asked, how should I give money, or what should I do, or what's more effective, or I don't know which race to give to, or I don't live in a competitive seat. So I think this is a godsend for people like that who know what they want to do and they just don't know where and how to do it. So thank you so much for coming on the show. And hopefully we will have those celebratory conversations at the end of the year. Thank you so much for visiting with us, Yasmin.
Thank you so much, Jen, and thank you to all your listeners for all that you're doing. Can't wait to celebrate a Democratic trifecta and power in the states in 2024.
I certainly hope you feel better. I feel better. It's not that there isn't a lot of work to be done. It isn't that we won't have unexpected setbacks. It isn't that Donald Trump is simply going to go away quietly. It's not that MAGA Republicans are going to recover their sanity and appreciation for democracy. I feel better because I can see how a victory is obtained and obtainable. You have to have an involved citizenry. You have to enlist thousands upon thousands of volunteers. You have to do the work of raising money. You have to be able to get a message out that is going to penetrate through all the noise and the distraction. And that's what Swing Left is actually doing. When I harangue you folks to stop scrolling through your doom Twitter feed, and get out there and do something. This is what I'm talking about. Finding groups that are active, that are using money to help elect Democrats who believe in the rule of law, who believe in democracy. So it's, I think, inspiration for all of us that there's plenty to be done. There's a lot of hard work ahead, but you too can help out, and you too can play a part in saving democracy. So there's work to be done. Get out there. If you enjoyed this program and you enjoyed our other programs, please tell your friends. They can listen and follow us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever they get their podcasts. Bye-bye.